Welcome to Other Lands Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I am Margaret Bates, and I've been an editor and also a ghostwriter for about a decade. And I've also worked on a lot of different types of fiction, from memoir to speculative fiction to romance.
Okay, I'm Midnight Voss. I am primarily a teacher of composition and rhetoric, got my doctorate in rhetoric and composition. Been teaching for almost 20 years and editing for several. It's been a wide range, but I do specialize in fantasy, dystopia, and urban fantasy.
Yeah, I would say that what I specialize in, even though I've had experience in some things I'm not necessarily a fan of editing or writing, is paranormal romance, also some contemporary romance, and urban fantasy and horror. So,
Okay, so I'm just going to start with a question of we have this big old topic. Can you explain what's in here? What's the my readers like it this way?
the sort of phrase was a paraphrase of a lot of times when I work with authors over the decade, and I've tried to nudge them to breaking some bad habits or some less developed skills that really are hindering them. They tend to blow it off. Not all of them, but some have blown it off by saying, my readers like it this way.
Yeah, as they're reading their readers' minds, and they know definitively that all of them, even the ones who never commented, really like this. I don't think I've ever seen a comment where someone said, I really like how I don't understand whose perspective I'm in, or I really liked how there was no ending to this. I was talking about this concept with my sister last night, and I was describing one of these points that we're going to go through, and she got so angry of apparently she encountered one of those, and some of them are scorched earth, I'm not going to read this author again level. Some of them are just kind of annoying, and you get through them if you want to read a niche thing. But on some of them, it really can turn your reader off permanently, I think.
You are the one who currently has the sheet of sort of our points
I
to go
do.
through of
Yeah.
where we're going, because there's so many things to cover. I could probably rant on some of them all day, but start wherever you'd like to with some of the habits that we've seen that can really turn readers off and make them not finish a book.
I think where we started before was with the poor genre fit, because that's sort of a bigger picture thing that you can address going in. There are definitely some people who feel like their creativity exceeds the bounds of genre, but at some point you do have to admit that you have an audience and that they are going to need some kind of expectations going in to understand how to cognitively frame this. This is something that you deal with in rhetoric a lot of what the expectation of the audience is will indicate how they receive. So expectation to some degree will override your creative division, or at least you have to meet in the middle. You're going to be making choices that signal to your reader what you are trying to accomplish. For example, when I was teaching the romanticy class recently, I had a lot of people who wanted to rebrand something they'd already written as romanticy without having done the lifting in world building and tone that would enable it to really fit in the genre, which is just going to make people mad.
It's like a double-edged sword because, yes, we're living in a time where the gatekeeping is different, and where if you wanted to today, you could have a plan, write a book in, 3 months, 6 months, a week, whatever, and put it up on Amazon or Kobo or those platforms. And it could be a melange and a mashup of like my sci-fi horror debutante romance book, but you have to again set those audience expectations. I'm not saying don't experiment with genre mashups. I'm not saying don't tell the story you want to tell, but I am saying it will make marketing harder. And that
Yeah.
if you're, like you said with the romantasy, if you're really just calling an Anita Blake style, a Harry Dresden style classic urban fantasy now romantasy and trying to shove that to readers, they're going to be very upset with that.
And it connects to that concept of the niche reader because romantasy is so damn popular right now. Like you can always just put that author down forever and pick up 30 others. So you don't want to be in that position where you really set yourself up to fail. And you just want to be honest about the genre. I think you can have mixed genre things. That's something that you do in promotions, is that you show them what the mix of the genre is of X meets Y. And people will be like, that sounds interesting. That sounds fresh and new because it sounds like you know what you're doing. Like I know where I fit.
I would caution with where you're mixing stuff up with genres, maybe two is a mix, three at max. If you start having
Yeah.
elements from five or six or four different things, and then it's not really any of those things, that can be really difficult. The idea of something like, I don't know, gothic horror meets YA, which is more an age group, but you know what I mean? Like you can
Yeah.
do things where they're mixed together, but if all of a sudden you have, think about like a milkshake, if you have four or five different flavors in there, it's not really
Just too
anything
much fun.
anymore. Yeah. And I think that this also applies not just to when you're going to set out to write a book
Yeah.
and when you're going to set out to make sure you it meets the reader expectations. It's also when you brand and when you do the marketing copy for the book. And I've told this story to you before, Midnight, but I had a client I worked for just as an author. She's a horror author, so she had a lot of success with doing haunted house fiction, and she had written a book that was more honestly of kind of a thriller. A woman goes to a cabin on the lake and it ends up that she's being stalked by someone. But the way it was branded and the way the blurb was kind of non-committal, and considering the rest of the author's books were ghost stories, people went in expecting another ghost story this time out on the lake, and they were getting a kind of a different genre with like psychological horror and stalking horror. So once she rebranded the blurb and explained that this is actually her sort of attempt to bridge into psychological horror, she did better. But before, she was getting slammed in her reviews because people were starting to read one thing and they were like, I didn't like that, it wasn't what I expected.
Yeah, it's just being honest about what is there because you might have an audience for what you're looking for. Like the thing that blend that you're trying to create, surely someone's out there thinking, well, why don't we have this? And that's how new genres are made.
People who I assume back in the day, like 6, 7 years ago, were trying to write science fiction or brand it as just science fiction, but really were more about reality-based games or gaming in general or being sucked into a computer console or whatever, became that genre of lit RPG later. And so it is
That's
also new niches come from sub niches within genres where it's not quite fitting the way it should.
Yeah, and that's an old one too, because it used to be a thing in the 80s and it stopped for a while after we got used to technology, and then people are drawn to it again. As things will come
Because
in cycles. And if you've written a book that you're like, well, this genre isn't popular right now, can I turn it into the new popular genre? Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you want to keep working on the series and then give it enough polish that when it comes back around, you can put it out there and really give it legs. But
and it always comes back around because I would say I got into writing and editing heavily in 2014 and paranormal was dead.
oh no.
Pun not intended, but it was all contemporary and billionaires, and it still is something in there. And then I think for a while it became more those illustrated cover rom-coms, but now you have this mix of romantasy, which is its own genre, but it's also stirred an interest in sort of lower stakes contemporary fantasy, which is still like paranormal characters, but not necessarily in the urban fantasy mold of a noir or detective story, or there's going to be a big fight at the end. But I've
Yeah,
seen, for the first time in a long time, an uptick in vampire fiction. The Even though I wasn't necessarily a fan of it, the book My Roommate is a Vampire is a whole series. Now, I was at a conference for the Emerald Romance writers, and some of the editors who were there were speaking about how that was an example of sort of that new cozy fantasy or contemporary kind of fantasy where, yes, the characters are paranormal, but a lot of their problems are just kind of everyday. But that's
yeah,
come in again, and every editor there or a couple people who were just agents were saying we're looking for vampires again, which if you had asked anybody that in about 2012, 2014, they said, no, we don't want single vampire,
yeah.
don't. But if
Monsters in
you,
particular. do tend to come in cycles. Like zombies were real hot for a little while, and then they burned out on vampires because Twilight flooded the market, and then we're back to vampires after a while. They can be romantic, but now they can also be scary again.
Yeah,
So
they've really
people
done a
get
lot
tired.
more with the horror. Yeah. But that's a good point because if you save those novels and things that really fit the genre so that in unfortunately 10 years when the cycle comes back, you've got them ready to go. It's
Yeah,
never going to work to fit it into something else. Like, which again goes back to your romantasy point because I feel a lot of people are trying to rebrand things that have werewolf and vampire characters as romantasy, which is kind of
yeah.
interesting because right now, like I said, certain types of vampire stories are really becoming hot, so to speak. So it's just better to try and fit it to what it
It's
is.
romantasy is the genre tide that lifts all boats. That where
Yeah.
like as you said, like these other things have risen as at the same time, which is interesting.
I was
Um,
listening to the Rebel
yeah, go
Author
ahead.
podcast this week, and they were talking to an author who writes different series. And I don't remember her name, I'll put it in the show notes, but in her case, she mentioned that for her, one of the things that helped her continue her career as trends came and went was having the flexibility to learn to write honestly to the trend for a while, have those trunk novels, saving of the ones that she were her heart's novels, in her case, in paranormal romance for when that came back. But she learned to write more in contemporary style or in historicals or whatever for the time being. She could sort of at least fit side interest way into that genre and go with the flow. So that's also a thought, but it's just never gonna work as well rebranding something that's clearly not that genre to try and shoehorn that genre.
Let's just put a cap on genre as we mentioned just a few things that would be genre killers. So for romance is going to be cheating is the genre killer. Like absolutely don't. I would say for fantasy, breaking your world building is the entire premise of fantasy is that you're taking us into another world and therefore you need to set up your rules. And so if you have a soft magic system, that means that you have a lot more leeway. But whatever it is, if you establish the rules and then somebody just breaks them for no reason, then you have no reason to believe in anything or believe in the stakes. For example, if you're in chapter 30 and the person is still getting new powers, or you establish that the X will automatically kill you, but they survived it, and there's no other reason for why they might. So those are a couple of things genre-wise that I think would maybe the DNF or maybe just the lack of trust. Do you have any other genres that we could put in that auto DNFs or
Well, I feel like with romance, besides the cheating, is not ending happily ever after or happily
yeah,
for
yeah.
now. Happily for now is more common, especially 5 or 6 years ago when they had sort of these new adult trilogies in the style of 50 Shades of Grey, where maybe it was rocky at the end of books one and two, but you knew by the end of the trilogy they'd be together. So maybe
Yeah,
there
yeah.
was some upturns or some happily for nows, which is it's okay, but it'll get better later. But if you say something's a romance and the characters end up with one dies or they break up, then it's not a romance. It can be fiction with romantic elements, or it could be women's fiction, or it could be, I
Yeah.
guess, whatever Nicholas Sparks calls his books, but they aren't romance. It's just the two things that romance readers seem to get the maddest at is cheating and no happy ending. And I liken that to in a mystery, sort of an Agatha Christie type homage, if you don't actually solve the murder at the end, people are going to be upset. So if you're out there writing a detective fiction book, the detective never solves the crime, not to be flippant, but that is also a genre where there is that expectation.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with other genres like horror, sometimes people survive in horror, sometimes it's the type of horror where everybody's dead by the end. I don't think it has a convention where it has to have a certain type of ending. So I think you can choose how you want to do that. Same with urban fantasy.
Yeah.
Although I really feel strongly with urban fantasy, if it's a long connected series, that if they're fighting against a greater bad guy, that at the end there should be some sense of triumph because people aren't going to invest in like a 3, 5, 7 book series to see the heroes ultimately fail. I'm not saying it's a whole full out Disney happy ending where everybody survives and it's perfect. Most of the time it's bittersweet. You lose some people, you might even lose the protagonist, but the rest of them go on. But I really think people aren't going to invest in a multi-book series if at the end the protagonist fails and basically rock falls and everybody dies.
Yeah, I guess you think of that as like, am I going to be a writer after this? Do I want them to look into my next series? Is that you can have a qualified ending of the first thing that jumps to mind actually is Doom Patrol, where actually in the comic though, when they have I can't remember what the great eyeball is that's unmaking the entire world. I think it's the D creator. And so the idea is that they go up against these impossible things and often they don't win. In the giant eyeball that's undoing the universe, they didn't defeat it. It doesn't get destroyed. It's still out there uncreating the universe, but it's doing it very slowly because they gave it a mental problem from one of the heroes, I think. I just gave it my ADD, so it's not going to focus very well. It'll take us a while to destroy the universe. So if you have the idea of not everyone stands up and like with flags and we get all the things that we want, if you want it to be like the tone of we have some successes, but not, you can do that and it can still be satisfying. You just have to understand that they didn't go through a 7 book series for everyone to literally die.
Yeah, and I think you can see that sometimes. I think in the biggest example I can think of that wasn't everybody dies, but where there was a lot of investment in one character story and they were not expecting her death was in the Divergent series by Veronica
Yeah,
Roth because through halfway through like the final novel in that Triss dies, so then it just switches to her love interest as the narrator because it's first person narration. And there was
yeah,
a
that's
huge
wild.
backlash to that. And honestly, you haven't seen her put out a ton of stuff since then because there was such an audience backlash to choose my narrator for this entire YA saga. I don't expect it to be happy because it's dystopian, but I did expect her to survive because of the way it was set up, and that, you know, that can affect it.
Right? Compare that to the end of the original Hunger Games trilogy where Prim dies and everything is horrible and you cry for 30 hours because you invested so hard in this character. But she wasn't the main character, and Katniss lives, and she has children with Peeta and whatever. And at least they accomplished their goal of getting rid of the Hunger Games and having a new, fresh government that would not be a totalitarian government, which was what was going to happen. So it is catastrophic emotionally, but there are wins there, and they didn't full out betray the reader. I think that's where they stop reading, is when they feel like you've betrayed their trust or their intelligence. Um, my only example for memoir is like the everyone stood up and clapped kind of thing, where you're like, you think I'm stupid that this actually happened this way? This isn't a Reddit post. That they expect some element of realism from memoir. You can't get super weird until after the first third with, oh, these crazy things happened. It needs to be somewhat realistic to the beginning, and then you can deviate a little bit if you look at Running with Scissors or something like that.
Yeah. Or if it's something where I think in a memoir, everything makes you look good, but everybody was secretly against you, it reads more like a manifesto or a selective editing of your life that people just aren't going to invest in. So that's something to be aware of
yeah.
if you're a memoir writer, to have some
People
truth
need
in
to
like
remember
those
that we
interactions.
we do enjoy characters that are messy. I mean, you wouldn't have John Constantine if that were not the case. If we want to shift into character problems, at the memoir, you're the main character, so you have to understand like you get to be the winner, but also you need to filter in the flaws as well. And that can be a problem with characters, the ones that will make us stop reading, the things that you can say, oh my audience likes it that way. I don't think that they do like it that way. When the thing that I've seen a lot people talking about is like the too stupid to live protagonist, the main heroine who doesn't have any adult thought, these characters that are not developed enough basically to be lifting an entire novel, especially in first person, because first person is very hard to write. They perceive it as the easiest thing to do because then you just use I, but then you have so many things that come along with writing in first person, especially first person present, that creates this exigence of which I am narrating everything in detail, but you have to be able to learn how to elide time and create a voice.
I think that's a good point because, and first of all, when you say uh, a heroine who doesn't know anything, we're not literally saying like a YA or an MG heroine. and denigrating on age. I have read so many books that are ostensibly a romantasy or an urban fantasy or a paranormal romance where the heroine's supposed to be in her 20s or 30s. But because of the narration style, where it is first person usually present, where there's a lot of sarcasm and sassiness as a substitute for personality trait, and where it's really granular, you're right, where you can't skip time or you're not learning to skip it properly in present tense. And so it's like talking about going and making breakfast, and you go through all the steps of her like frying the eggs or going to do her morning routine and all the steps of brushing her teeth that no one actually cares about. Not if your story is going to be about how your heroine starts her first day at Dragon Riding Academy. I'm not here for her brushing her hair. But when you do
Yeah,
that
that's
and have this problem where you have a heroine or a hero for that matter who's making the wrong choices, and I'm not saying not being messy, I'm saying they really don't reflect on anything at all. They don't seem to, even as the course of the novel goes on, really learn anything, and they keep making the same mistakes. Again, I'm not expecting, if your book's about some young apprentice who's learning magical skills or karate skills or sword fighting skills, for them to be aces on day one. But if they're still being as reckless and making as many mistakes towards the end of the book and just being as hair-tempered and all that kind of stuff that late in the book, I'm going to be a little frustrated that they aren't really doing that, repeating that same impetuous nature.
yeah, the issue that I'm talking about, like you give a lot more leeway to the young adult protagonist unless you're being unreasonable. You understand that the young adult protagonist does not have the same kind of brain development as the one in the 20s, but then we think also about the protagonist as having some kind of impact on the narrative. And like you mentioned, that they're not learning anything, they're not doing anything, they're not active. That's one of the problems in first person is if everything's happening to them and they're not reacting to it or evolving or making choices, then they're maybe not actually the main character of this. They just are the one who are narrating it. And that's a little boring. It also makes them look stupider because you have to withhold information from them in order for the plot to continue, but it makes them look dumb because the audience figured this out like 20 chapters ago. So it's a balance that you have to make. You have to make sure that they have enough character that we can like them in some way. They don't have to be a good person. We all just watched Agatha all along, and she's a serial killer.
Yeah, she's
So
a terrible person.
she's a terrible person, and we love it. So you definitely can make them a flawed person. They don't have to be perfect, but they need to be somewhat realistic. They need to have personality traits. We need to have something where we can look at them and say, yeah, that person does have something that's likable about them. And they have to have some kind of investment in what's happening so that we can
And
see them doing things. Yeah.
and I think one thing is where you mentioned that Agatha all along is a terrible person. I'm not saying it makes it better, but it actually does for me. If she acknowledges all the time that she's a terrible person, she knows. I think it's very hard to read a character who's presented as the protagonist and is presented as supposed to be the good guy you root for, but they're doing awful, selfish things, and they never once stop and reflect and own the fact that they've either made a mistake or actually their pattern behavior is kind of crappy. Like you could be crappy, but if that's what you're owning as kind of an anti-hero character, that makes sense. You mentioned John Constantine before, of course. But I have read in the last couple books I've read have had protagonists who are doing really questionable things, who are just not there for their friends and their support systems, who kind of play dice with the universe and are really not caring too much if they kill a bad guy, that kind of stuff. But they're still presenting themselves and in their inner first person thoughts, thinking themselves as very moral. And it's both a cognitive dissonance and disconnect, and it's just not interesting. It's not interesting for someone who doesn't have any accurate self-reflection as something to read when they're supposed to be like at least an adult in 20 or 30 years of age, not necessarily in YA or coming of age fiction where you're still figuring yourself out. It's a little, like you said, more leeway. But yeah, if the protagonist is awful but doesn't know or commit to the fact that they know they have bad aspects to themselves, then it's just really frustrating.
I think that's another thing that third person will get you is that you can, as the narrator, kind of shade your character a little bit so that they know you know they're terrible. But from first person, like if they don't have that sense of self-reflection and they're doing terrible things, and you don't have anything in the narrative itself showing us that this is just their being an unreliable narrator of I haven't watched that much of The Boys, but I guess Homelander thinks that he's wonderful, is that you have a character who thinks that everything they do is great, but then the rest of the world is like, okay, yeah, you're a narcissist, whatever. It's like Joe and you thinking I'm justified and they made me do these things until his subconscious forces him to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I
So
really enjoyed, without spoilers, but I enjoyed in general in season 4 how they really deconstructed these 3 years of Joe telling himself, he had to do all this serial killing and just making him face that actually you're a terrible person. You're not the white knight you think you are. Because it had been getting to the point earlier in the seasons where you're like, he just keeps getting away with things. He keeps abusing women. I'm really tired of him skating. And then it's like, oh, it's part of those cracks your writer's showing in his subconscious by now as part of the arc of that whole story.
yeah, I don't think most of these people are trying to write the such a layered meta commentary on their narcissistic character. I think they haven't done enough character development to realize how they could affect who that character is in the narrative and then make it entertaining. That's like it's just a lot of effort. It's like looking at the alpha hole as a character if he has no redeeming values besides being hot and rich, and I'd kind of rather not put up with him
And abs.
actually.
I guess
And
it's a
abs
subheading of hot.
of
Yeah,
hot.
but just that aggressiveness. But I mean, some people like alpha male characters in their romance literature or
Yeah.
books, but I do think that that is that risk, and that's why the expression came to be. Instead of being just an alpha male, you're an alpha hole, and everything you do is basically abusive and denigrating, and it's too alpha and just too much of just being a jerk, so that at that point the personality, even if you have the abs and the billions, people are not going to put up with it. Another character thing you mentioned was, is the lead character really interesting enough and active enough to be the main character? Again, I've read a couple of different series, and I think The House of Night, which is not a good book series, but it's about this girl who's a witch vampire, essentially, who goes to Witch Vampire Academy for high school, whatever. Yeah, as you do. But she's not very interesting. The much more interesting character is, her name's Aphrodite. They assume these names of mythological creatures when they got inducted into the school, and they choose their House of Night name or whatever. But Aphrodite is the typical snotty, rich, mean girl at first, but then you see all these looks into her relationships with her family and the expectations on her. And because of her seer type gift, she was the hot, trendy thing before our protagonist got there. But the more you see of her kind of getting stomped down, Aphrodite, I mean, the more you realize that she's interesting and has layers, whereas the heroine's kind of set on autopilot, where everybody always praises her, and it does border on this Mary Sue thing where she can do no wrong. But the other character who's trying really hard just keeps getting cut down most of the time, not every time, but most of the time, becomes where the bully character becomes more sympathetic than the hero or heroine because they have more
Yeah.
layers, which is a risk. Like, you don't want that to end up happening.
Yeah, it's easier actually sometimes to make the villain more interesting than your protagonist. That's unfortunate. If you wanted to make a second book with the bully character being the lead, then that's a good idea, but you still need to make sure that your protagonist is good enough because you want to make sure that they like the first book before they get to the next book.
I think there's like a continuum, like a U-shaped curve of flaws. You can't have a completely perfect hero or heroine who never did anything wrong, is a Mary Sue, is good at everything, and just gets along with everybody. Obviously, you can't have a hero who's so flawed that eventually they go to the point where they're murdering people and like doing, I mean, everything terrible, or they become Homelander. You kind of have to hit that sweet spot where they're trying, they're struggling, they know that there are things they're not good at, and they're trying to do better as a hero because
Yeah.
it makes it relatable to people who are struggling. And I keep seeing that meme around lately where people complain that DC Comics and Warner Brothers don't know what to do with Superman, and they're like, he's too squeaky clean. Who cares about a Kansas farm boy or whatever in 2024? Who would care about the undocumented immigrant who helps his family struggling farm and then goes to be a journalist? and fights against the megalomaniacal billionaire who eventually becomes president in this day and age. And it's like there
Yeah,
are
can't
things within
imagine.
this, yeah, right? There are things within the source text that people don't think about or gloss over for, oh, he's a Gary Stu of superpowers and he used to be from a farm. And it's like, no, obviously, if you wrote it right, he'd be struggling with identity and with loyalty and with feeling literally alienated. And then with how do you get truth out in an era where you can't seem to get anybody to listen to reality? And those are all really salient struggles that if you wanted that take, and we'll see what James Gunn does with it, but on Superman and Clark Kent could be, as relevant now, unfortunately, as it was in 1937. So,
Yeah, DC has a problem in that I think that they had some people take over that really didn't understand the characters and they wanted to make them all like broody, grimdark. But as there are characters within the DC stable that you can use for that, and Clark shouldn't be one of them because he's too powerful for that. It's like he needs to be better. Otherwise, he turns into Elseworld Superman who's going to destroy everybody. So you have to think about what is the core of this character. And if you have a character that is genuinely good and that everyone should like, they're still not all going to like them. That's the problem, is that the side character interactions are really important to that. Of like, you get this sense of injustice if you have a character who's genuinely good and doesn't want to hurt people, but um they're always coming up against people who they wouldn't believe that necessarily, or that they are looking at them for superficial reasons. I've seen also on the side of this of like the genuinely good character or even the terrible character, as the side characters are just cheerleaders. They could have been replaced by a lamp that says good job. And
yes,
so why are they there? We don't need them. We need your side characters to help us move into the story with your characters. And it can be useful if you have a character that's genuinely a terrible person, but then they have these few characters where they're soft with them and you can see the other side. Or you have the character that is genuinely a good person, but then you have that one character that brings out something in them.
I think for me, that lamp principle is important. We came up with it while watching Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and they were making a big deal before it happened of introducing America Chavez, but she could have been a lamp for she was just a MacGuffin that he or an object that he had to protect, but she had just not any personality development, any real scenes of depth with him. If you can replace it with a lamp, or we used to joke our pet Chihuahua, and it would have as much effect on the storyline as it does with an actual quote human character, then you're having a problem. And I
Yeah, there
think
were a lot
that,
of problems with that movie, but if your entire goal was to introduce a major character, like they did not characterize her at all.
yeah,
They were so much
exactly.
more interested in Doctor Strange's like deserved losing of his girlfriend. So I don't care about this dude,
Yeah,
but it's his
exactly.
movie.
But you have to just be really careful about with side characters if they basically have so little personality or agency that they're a lamp. Also, the cheerleader side, like I've seen so many cases, and this is very common in romance novels, where the best friend only exists to basically vicariously get her groove on through her best friend, who's the heroine. So all they
Yeah.
do is exist to cheerlead the relationship, which seems at first logical, but then if you realize the heroine's best friend usually is going to get spun off into her own novel, or that's the hope if you have a group of friends and one heroine goes first, but then the rest follow. If you don't make them more interesting than just cardboard cutout who cheerleads, you're not going to have a base to do that spin-off follow-up novel either if you want to write a series. And with romance, that's really where the money is in creating a series, and often in the Bridgerton style of technically it's related, it's all in the same world, but it follows like a group of family and siblings, or a group of best friends, or a group of frat brothers, whatever. So you can do one after the other. So once the first HEA and happy couple happens, they can sometimes guest star or cameo in the following group's adventures. But again, if all the side characters or the other members of your sorority are flat as pancakes, it's not going to work.
Yeah. Let's shift into talking about pacing because you did mention up the series issue, which is a common, it's what a lot of people will want to do.
Yeah.
Because it will eventually deal with money. But if you're thinking in fantasy and urban fantasy, maybe you do think in 5 to 7 book series. Even within contemporary, you're like, I got attached to writing these characters. I want to continue with them. We do have a problem with pacing with that. And I'll start with the side character who gets their own book of I've read in editing, people set up that side character as in they're not doing anything in the novel whatsoever, but then in the last third, they suddenly have the first beat, the next book instead, and they don't really finish solidly on the first couple. They just kind of introduce the next couple, which is a terrible idea because that means you go into the next book assuming that they already have that first beat, but you haven't developed it in its own book. And simultaneously, you've destroyed the ending for the one couple that we're supposed to be attaching to. So you really have to think about each book is your reader's entryway into deciding that they trust you as an author well enough that they're going to read the other books. And so that means that book one is going to be beginning, middle, and end of its own thing. And then you have to consider what's next from that instead of saying, well, I want to write a 7 book series. So I'm going to string you along for 15 chapters and then introduce an idea, have them start dealing with it, then stop the book mid scene so that you'll click on the next book. That's enraging.
Also, trust is a commodity. It really is. I think we know this from our personal relationships and with our friends or family. Once you break trust, it takes forever to rebuild it. And that's in, again, personal relationships with your friends or family might be kind enough to give you that benefit of a doubt to prove yourself worthy again. With reading, especially, let's be honest, in this economy, if I'm going to spend money on a book and it breaks that covenant with me and breaks that trust, I'm going to move on to another author because I don't want to risk having a second book by that same author do the same kind of ploys. And that's really
Yeah.
frustrating. So once you get that reputation, the reader, you can honestly not just become a do not finish for that one book. You could be on a never to read again list by a reader just because you've taken advantage of that trust.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I have seen people say, like, my readers like it this way. No, they don't. Anyone who's reading through likes other things about your books, and they're putting up with this. And this isn't fan fiction. You don't get to have a Cliffy on everyone. If you have, you get to choose your Cliffies. And I've seen more comments on Goodreads or Amazon where they're like, "This person just stopped. I'm not going to read them again." Of
Yeah,
like,
I think
it's
that's
a
the
betrayal.
difference with the cliffhanger, the Cliffies, versus the cliffhanger that leaves some loose ends versus I literally just stopped. I just stopped the book because I want to sell book two.
Yeah, so let's take an example here, and I'm rereading The Hunger Games, which is why you get so many examples from this, is that in the first book, obviously, the first thing that's going to happen is that she builds the world, she volunteers for the Hunger Games, she goes into the Hunger Games and has a struggle romantic plot, gets out, survives, she won. That's the success. At the end, there's the hint that, well, you're in this for life now because that's how that works. Of now that you're a victor, their eyes are going to be on you forever. The end. She got another book. Next book, the eyes are on you. Shocking. And then we move into the next set of the Hunger Games, and that one does left Lynn on a cliffhanger. They get out of the second games, but then they say that District 12 is destroyed and it's over. And they get to do that because one, it was wildly popular. And two, the first book was so solid in the setup. And you'll see this with series that go further in, I'm going to say mostly like traditional publishing, of like that first book sets up things very strongly.
And I
And
think
yeah, go ahead.
that's also an artifact of traditional publishing. Sure, they want to take on a book that may have series potential. That's how they phrase it, series potential. But they are going to be expert editors and literary agents who read a slush pile of hundreds of stories a year, if not thousands, and they are going to look for a book that they can, let's be real, sell. So they're going to need one
Yeah.
that as a complete book because they need something that will stand enough on its own. But if it lightning strikes, is popular, could have potential to have legs later. Like even Twilight, which people bring up as very popular, was originally written as a one book deal. You can really see that with how, especially in the book itself, in the series it's written, she goes back and realizes that she can, after the fact, manufacture a lot of emphasis on Jacob and doing a love triangle to stretch out over two or three other books. But as it was conceived, Twilight was a one and done deal. Just like the Hunger Games, she got other books, but one and done. But that mentality really teaches the writers who are submitting to traditional publishing to create books that have a conclusion that has a satisfying character arc for that character for that book. And again, leaves the threads of, oh, now this might happen. Now there's increased scrutiny on Katniss as a winner. How's she going to deal with that? But
Yeah.
not, oh, she's still in the games. Rue just died in the book.
That would be terrible. I would never read that. What that makes me think of is like not everyone listening is going to be looking to traditionally publish, but we think of it slightly differently, is that you're not necessarily going to have that slush pile and try to get them to can take you on as, is this going to be a one good book that will sell? You're thinking of that first book as you're putting this into the agent as your reader. Your reader is looking at this first book as like, is this going to be something that I'm going to continue with? And you might even use that first book as your loss leader of saying, well, sometimes I'll just have this first book free. And if you hook them well enough and then you continue writing, then they're going to be going through and clicking through the rest of that series. But that first book really needs to sell it. You need to get them attached to those characters. It's like,
A calling
go ahead.
card, like it's your
Yeah.
branding for your readers. If your calling card and your signature is, I will get you three-quarters of the way through the story and stop, and then I need you to buy the new book. Like if I buy book two, am I gonna have to buy book three and four and still keep getting non-endings? If you really think about it, my readers like it or not, the reputation you really want to build with a reader base. Again, there is a subset of readers who will read through cliffhangers voraciously who have been conditioned for that over the years, especially in Kindle Unlimited, but it's a smaller subset, and that's like the risk you're running.
And I wouldn't trust Kindle long term, as it's there now. If you want to consider that social media is going to change and distributors are going to change, and you want to be careful about being too dependent on them because their policies shift back and forth.
There's been a push to wide because of lower Kindle
Yeah.
Unlimited payouts, and if you're exclusive to Kindle and someone unfortunately pirates your book, you could get removed just because of the piracy without a lot of ban recourse or ability to argue your case. So a lot of people have started to go wide for their own safety of their careers. And also in the last couple of years with how Shopify has evolved, people are starting to sell direct. But at this uh and we'll talk more about some of these later in other podcasts, but the bottom line is you're still trying to build a reputation with your readers so they'll come to you. And you need to show them that you can finish a complete story in one book.
Yeah.
Also with pacing, besides the I just stopped and that you have to read the final battle in the next book, the sequel baiting if it were if it were a movie. But I also think that people are not always sure what consists of an event that actually moves the plot forward and isn't
Yeah.
just spinning wheels or adding page length.
Yeah, I think that's it's definitely going to be something that we talk about in depth later. But as you've described it as like having the interstitial moments fill up the pages rather than actually having the plot fill up the pages, where we have all of these side moments where people are getting ice cream or going for coffee or making pancakes, and it's a scene in a sitcom, but nothing really happened. Um,
Or sexy banter, which I love banter. Everybody does, but if it's pages of that and nothing's happening, it does sometimes the readers lose interest.
Yeah, you're looking mostly to have scenes do multiple things. So sexy banter on top of fighting slimes in a cave would be both. Like let's do the two things at once. Let's multitask. Is that the problem with the interstitials is that if they're not doing something that's progressing the plot, then we're letting the plot breathe. And if they're only doing that, and I have read ones where it's like you have the initial thing that happens, but then nothing really happens until another point in the book. They're just having breakfast and getting to know each other. You can do that if you're Jane Austen, but we're not reading a Jane Austen novel, which I guess is the point of genre. If you're doing something else, then yeah, you can do certain things where you're moving us forward from ball to ball, but it's not the same as if you're looking to have a larger overarching plot. And seen this in historicals, I've seen this in urban fantasy and paranormal, where they do have a bigger problem but they're not addressing it until very end where they introduce the problem, like the next plot point. So you're giving away your tension. Is that if you start strong and then do nothing for a while, then you're giving away your tension, and the tension is what should drive us to the very end of the book, is that it should make us not want to put it down. Of we're introducing a problem and refusing to solve it until the tension is too much and then explodes, and then we reassert some kind of normal and then throw other rocks at characters. That's the aim of what you're doing, is you don't want to let out too much.
And I think that's a balance, and it's something writers learn as they write and as they work with editors or they work with feedback from beta readers or other writers and writers groups because it's hard. Because there is this balance of I need to keep the tension going and the plot going, but I need to have that scene and sequel where I
Yeah.
do have moments that are quiet, that are thoughtful, where the characters bond or reflect. So they're not just robots running through the plot. And it does take a long time to learn that balance where it doesn't either drag or it doesn't hit all these points, but by the end, the readers don't know the characters well, so they don't care emotionally. And that's kind of unfortunately the name of the game, but it doesn't help if they really just drag in scenes of banter and banter and banter or eating or going to the mall or whatever. So you just have to be mindful of pacing on a lot of levels. We're sort of rounding out our hour of my readers
Yeah.
like it this way. We're trying to keep these mindful of people and their commuter schedule and not wanting to listen to a podcast for hours. But is there any other sort of takeaways or final thoughts on uh, habits or things you've seen writers do where it's my readers like it this way, but you know that it's the reverse effect? It's really driving readers off or being just deleterious to a career.
I don't think I have more things that we could talk about in detail right now, but I think I would just pick up for a takeaway of something you were saying of we want to get them invested. And the more invested they are, the more you'll be able to just practice this as you go. Is a lot of things will be put on the wayside if they really like your characters or if they're really invested in the premise. And so it's not something that you have to learn all at once, but it is something that the more you listen to people talk about it and the more you think about it, the more you're going to be able to practice in getting readers on board and not doing these sort of shortcuts that end up turning readers off.
Yes. And I think one other thing that I think is a beginning theme here, that whether you're going to go the traditional publishing route or hybrid, or even be someone who is flat out indie and just going direct, that you really need to understand expectations, whether it's genre expectations or plotting expectations or the expectations of telling a complete story within the space of the book. And I believe that starts with researching where you are. If you really want to write a romantasy, read a bunch of the good ones and think about how your writing applies to that or your plot applies to that. Understand what the expectations are, kind of the same way. If you're a jazz musician, you have to understand music theory and composition and what
Yeah.
the others have done before you can go and do extemporaneous and a lot of spontaneous jazz sessions, or else it's not going to work. Again, I'm not saying, you can't do more experimentation, especially as an indie author. You can't try and mix genres or try different plot structures, but you only have to understand why it is that it's done usually the way it is and appreciate that before you try changing different things. So you're doing those differences and trying the things your reader specifically like after study and careful decision of it. Don't do it blindly because you don't know the depth of your genre or the depth of the
Yeah.
publishing industry expectations.
It's you being mindful of it. It's the craft of it, of understanding what's been before and what you aim to do so that you can find the best ways to do what you want with your story.
Yeah, and I think that's the one last thing I want to impart is I know people sometimes feel like sometimes it seems that writing has become so mechanical. I've got to do these kind of tropes to integrate them, and I have to make each chapter 2,000 words, and it needs to only be 80,000 words, and it needs to, and I don't want to feel hemmed into a tight recipe. So we're definitely not saying that. I'm just saying mostly make sure you know what's gone before and what's expected so you can make those decisions on what is the best match between your style and your vision and kind of what you can get away with by making that something that can find its own niche that's flourishing.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm glad you joined us, and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon. And in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.